Just out of college, and despite having a degree, it was almost impossible for me to get a job. Day after day, week after week, I sent out my resume to every game developer and computer company in the country and a few in Europe and Asia. 6 months into this, my money was running very low. This was when I was forced to face the facts. I needed a job immediately, and it didn't matter where and for how much. Just in time, I found a job listing for a video game store at the mall. You know the one I mean, and the terrible stories you hear about them are almost always true. Because of my background in games, I was given an interview immediately and hired soon after. My first shift was the following morning. Other than a few hiccups along the way, it kept my head above water until I got on with Dell 2 years later. The meat of the facts began just before my second year was about to start. Because of the high turnover, I was made an assistant manager by month 9. None of my shifts were evenings, so I was tasked with keeping the younger employees in line, a job I never really took seriously since I was only a few years older than they were. I didn't care how they acted as long as they did their job. Around this time, a girl was hired that could have been my undoing. The second I saw her, I knew she would be a problem. However, it wasn't just her that was the source of trouble. Her super jealous boyfriend became a thorn in the side of every guy that worked with her, and sometimes just spoke to her. A shift of hers didn't go by without him showing up to check on her. Some nights, he would do no more than sit on a bench outside the store and watch her work, but anytime she would get too close to a guy for his liking, he'd approach them and physically intimidate the guy she was talking to. She never said a thing when this happened. I actually think she kind of liked it, but it would be what would push her away from him in the end. She'd worked at the store for a couple of weeks before someone showed her the hallways that ran along the back of every place. She took advantage of the fact he wasn't aware of them, and this turned out to be a big mistake. If any person reading this doesn't know what I'm talking about, pay attention. You're about to learn something. I'm not sure how common this is, but some indoor malls, those built in the old way where each store inhabited an area that leased from the mall owner, there are a network of paths or halls that run behind each business. They're used mainly by the employees. The system allows them to enter and leave their jobs without being seen by the customers. Although I'm pretty sure their intended purpose was to give janitorial staff an uncluttered pathway to maintain the spaces. That being said, in all my time at that job, I only saw a member of the cleaning staff a handful of times. Most of those times, they were sneaking a cigarette rather than working. Luckily, we could still smoke inside the building back then. No one said anything to the office if they caught you, probably because they were doing the same thing on their breaks. If we are all on the same page now, I'll get to the real story. Like I said, his jealousy, no matter how it turned her on, was at the same time pushing her away. On her breaks, she'd often sneak out the back and disappear for a while. Where she went, I had no idea or really cared. The boyfriend took forever to catch on, but when he did, he was super angry. She continued this routine for a few months, and just one day, she never came back to the store. I didn't attach any importance to this. It was during the holidays and work was a nightmare. It wasn't uncommon for employees to go on break after an especially hectic rush and not return. The turnover was simply that bad. Things got a bit more interesting about 4 or 5 days later. The police showed up and had some questions about her disappearance. I was like, disappearance? What's going on here? They then informed me that she had been reported missing the day after she bailed on work by her parents. She had never made it home, and they thought we may know something. The crazy thing was that when they visited her boyfriend's place to see if she was there, in addition to him not being there, after some digging, they learned that nobody had seen either of them for about a week. I was quick to make it clear that I didn't know anything. I had just assumed she got sick of the place and bailed. I guess they were happy with that. Never heard from them again. Time passed, and the situation around her almost faded completely from my mind, until something really big in February happened and brought it back into crystal clarity. Some workmen were renovating one of the store's spaces for an incoming client, and once they had completed emptying the space of what the previous renters had left behind, they began the undertaking of finding the source of a terrible smell. Initially, it had been inferred that the smell was emanating from some old food products left behind in the space, but even after the clearing, the stink remained. The next theory was that an animal like a rat had died in the wall. It had happened before. So, before they went to the extreme of busting holes in the walls to find the source of the smell, they went next door to the adjoining space that was also empty and had been for some time. They spent close to an hour sifting through tons of old displays and leftover building materials. It turned out that the mall had been using this space for years as storage and the place was a mess. The two guys tasked with doing this were about to say forget it, when one of them stumbled upon the source of the stink, and it definitely wasn't a rat. Someone had taken a large piece of plywood and put it over a tiny little closet, thus making it invisible. The guy had caught on that the smell grew worse as he got closer to this board, so he pushed aside the heavy display rack holding the board against the wall, and as soon as he pulled back the board, he found what was causing it. The semi-mummified body of what looked like a female was lying on the floor facing the wall. It appeared the arid and dry Arizona heat had preserved the corpse and suppressed decomposition. This had to have been why it wasn't stinking up the entire mall and managed to remain hidden for so long. Naturally, the mall was alive with talk of who the body could possibly belong to. Numbers of people had just stopped coming to work one day or skipped out during their lunch. We'd gone through at least 15 people in the last year ourselves. When the answer came, no one could have guessed who it was. Early one morning, I was awakened by my manager with the news that Becky Morrison was the person they found in the empty store. My only answer was, "Who?" He reminded me that she was the girl with the crazy, jealous boyfriend that had disappeared just before Christmas. I hung up and went back to sleep. When I returned from my shift that night, it was the only thing anyone could talk about. The next question asked was, who did it? The overall favorite was the crazy boyfriend. Everyone knew by now that he had disappeared just after her, and considering his body wasn't found alongside hers, it was a fair assumption. He was most definitely nuts. It made sense. The story took a whole new angle just a couple of weeks after she was identified. An article was published in the paper discussing a possible new motive behind this. The police had recently received information that Becky had been messing around with a fellow mall employee during her breaks. They were meeting in the unoccupied store her body had been discovered in and fooling around. After following some leads, they were able to identify the employee. He was a 22-year-old guy working in the Hallmark store, but no name was given. He told the officers that he and Becky were supposed to hook up the day she disappeared, but he got holed up by the time he'd reached the empty space and she was gone. He figured she couldn't wait and returned to work. It was only a few days later, when the cops showed up at the mall to ask questions, that he heard she was missing. His mind went straight to the worst, and he was afraid he'd be blamed for it, so he said nothing. Then, when the news reached him that the boyfriend was also missing, it was too late. He figured if the boyfriend was hiding out, waiting for his chance to get him, it was best for him to say nothing, just on the off chance he didn't know for sure who the guy was. It all boiled down to him being afraid, and with what I knew, I could understand. What nobody knew, and still probably doesn't, is that her and I had a thing for a short while too. It wasn't long, but once is all it takes. I was the person who told her about the back hallways, after all. We slipped out there a few times to mess around. Fortunately, we never got busted. When she moved on to the next guy, I wasn't hurt. I knew she had a boyfriend anyway. Now you know why I had to act as if though I didn't care about her. We figured it was the safest thing for the both of us. Turns out we were right. I was overjoyed no one knew about us. If the dude was crazy enough to strangle her for cheating, which seemed to be the reason, he would no doubt come after the dude she was with. I felt sorry for the Hallmark guy. It wouldn't take much mental math to figure out who he was, if he didn't already know, and since they still haven't found him to this day, the fear of her boyfriend popping up out of nowhere and putting some holes in him must have been real strong. I know I was looking over my shoulder for several years after. The police have this theory that he may have ended his life not long after. There hadn't been any activity on his bank account or card for years, and I still wasn't taking any chances. 9 years later, a week doesn't go by that I don't think about her. An outsider may have seen her as an easy girl, but I still don't think of her that way. It struck me that she was just looking for a guy that would treat her well and commit to her for the long term without being psychotic about it. She was genuinely a good person, and certainly didn't deserve the end she had, but then again, I can't think of very many that do. The week leading up to the Christmas holiday, my family, consisting of one son, a daughter, my wife, and myself, took a last-minute trip to a small outlet mall-type place about 20 miles away from our home. We had 1 or 2 presents left to get, and we knew the place had what we needed. After 3+ hours of shopping, the whole family was beginning to complain about being hungry. The food court contained this little Italian place that had awesome spaghetti and lasagna, so we chose it. It came as no surprise that my son wanted chicken nuggets and fries. They made up a good 95% of his diet. Unfortunately, on this occasion, the Italian food wasn't that good. All 3 of us, eating it, thought it tasted a little funny, but because we were starving, most of it was eaten. My son, on the other hand, was pleased with his and had me wishing I would have just chosen Chick-fil-A too. Although we didn't like it, none of us felt bad or had any reason to believe anything was wrong with our food. No one said so at the time, at least. When everyone finished their meals, we headed home. The following morning, I was awakened around 4:15 with the worst cramps I've ever felt. I noticed my wife was already using our bathroom, so I had to use the one in the hall. The next hour was torture, consisting of vomiting and diarrhea on levels to the point of unknown. In between explosions, I could hear the sounds of my wife suffering through the paper-thin walls. The idea that we had food poisoning first came up that morning. I was granted a brief reprieve from my sickness, just long enough to go check on my wife and get a drink of water. I also took some to her, but she just couldn't keep it down long enough. Our son came into our room around now to tell us that our daughter was also very ill and had locked herself in the bathroom upstairs. His only concern was that he had nowhere to go to the bathroom. I told him to be considerate of others and stop being such a brat. If he needed to go so bad, he could go in the backyard. It was one of the few benefits of being a man, I suppose. I was planning on saying something else, but the cramps started again, so I had to run back to the bathroom. The whole time I was stuck in that place, the only thing I could think of was, why didn't I go to Chick-fil-A instead? I thought about it, but I knew my girls wanted Italian, so we went there. I catch myself doing that a lot. It took some time, but I was able to purge myself of the poisoning. While my stomach remained on the sour side, the need to lock myself in the bathroom had passed. Once again, I checked on my wife and found her condition to still be terrible. I also knocked on the upstairs bathroom door. When I got no answer, I knocked again and still got nothing. Something told me that this didn't bode well. I forced myself in and discovered my daughter unconscious on the floor next to a giant puddle of vomit. When I checked her pulse, I could barely feel anything. Trying not to panic, I ran down to my bedroom and grabbed my phone. I dialed 911 as fast as I could and told them my daughter and wife were very sick and that my daughter was unconscious. I'd completely forgotten about myself. They were my only concern. The 2 ambulances arrived quickly and rushed them both to the hospital. I scooped up my son and we followed in my car. This would be the first long day of many in the coming weeks, and not just for my family. My daughter's illness was found to be the worst and landed her almost 3 weeks in the hospital, some of it in the ICU, while my wife's, though still being bad, passed within the week. I myself was forced to spend the night to take fluids, but compared to them, I got off easy. I would quickly come to light that we were not the only ones to become sick after eating at that place. The rumors spread like wildfire through the hospital that a massive salmonella outbreak had started. These rumors were confirmed a day later when the news reported to the full extent of the spread. At that point, 14 people had been infected. 2 of them, an older couple, passed away the same night we first spent in the hospital. The numbers would reach 36 infected over the 2 days the restaurant was allowed to stay open. The final toll was reported to be 11, when the last victim, an 8-year-old girl who had been on life support for 2 weeks, was allowed to pass by the family. As the winter of 2018 became the spring of 2019, life eventually returned to normal, whatever normal is. My wonderful woman had been back home for a couple of months, so we decided to have the Christmas we never got to have. All the presents we had purchased were still sitting in the spare bedroom. The week of Easter seemed appropriate. The rest of the family was invited over for food in which all the proper safety measures were practiced, by the way. And we exchanged presents with one another and had an all-around great time. I may be speaking for myself, but it was the best Christmas I'd celebrated in my life. It may go without saying that the little Italian place could never bounce back from all the bad press. They reopened soon after the problem was discovered, but no one would go back, and they soon closed for good. They had already closed by the time we were able to go shopping at the mall again, and just getting up the courage to do that took a while. Of course, we wouldn't have eaten there anyway. I've learned my lesson. As of the 1st of September, when I'm writing this, we've only been back to the mall once since that nightmare of a meal. Even before stepping foot in the parking lot, eating anywhere in that food court was banned. My daughter has become a vegan since returning from the hospital, and I can't say I really blame her. I love to have the self-control to go that way myself, but I can't pretend to be something I'm not. These days, on the rare occasions we don't eat at home, 99% of the time, we go to Chick-fil-A, and we've never had a bad meal from there. This has proven to me that I was right to want to go there in the first place. Before I wrap this letter up, I want to take the opportunity to express my deepest condolences on behalf of myself and my family to the families of those who perish because of this awful act of negligence. Your loved ones' memories will always remain in our thoughts and prayers. I wrestled back and forth with whether I should share this story. Amy had been my best friend since kindergarten, and I would never want to do something that would have hurt her, but the fact is, her repeated bad choices put her in the place she ended up in. The local press has done their best to create a picture that isn't true. She is far from the good girl that they had painted her to be, and the public deserves to hear the truth, so they can make an informed decision regarding the outcome. Everything written here comes from a person that witnessed her actions firsthand and was present at the time the crime was committed. My part in it was negligible, and I have been punished for it. Anyone who says I betrayed her by testifying against her, I say in fact it was her who betrayed her friend by doing what she did. I certainly wouldn't have participated in any of it had I known what she had planned. If that's all we need to address, I'll get to my story. Amy and I both got our jobs at American Eagle around the same time. We loved the job, and working with my best friend was the coolest. Even when we weren't scheduled together, we spent most of our shift talking on the phone. Our managers didn't really care. They spent their shifts hitting on girls in the store. They had done the same to us when we first started, but we just laughed at them. They were almost old enough to be our dads, and that's gross. We had boyfriends anyway. Spencer, my boyfriend, was a senior and the quarterback of our school's football team. Amy's guy, Neil, was, I suppose, a real bad boy, just like the kind you see in the movies. He had the motorcycle and all that kind of stuff. They fought a lot, and the worse he treated her, the more she loved him. Even through all of this, she was still the most popular girl in school. All the teachers loved her, and regardless of how much she skipped, she never failed a single class. I'll admit, I was jealous of her sometimes. Her life seemed so perfect. Guys were always trying to hook up with her, but Neil was the only guy she cared about. Then one day, everything began to change. Neil and Amy had gotten in another one of their 1,000,000 fights, but this time they didn't make up, and Neil started dating another girl. Megan also worked at the mall. She was an assistant manager at Hot Topic. Amy didn't know that they were together until she saw Neil and her in the food court one night, kissing. She was super angry and confronted them. Even after Amy called Megan all sorts of terrible names, they both ignored her. Neil called her a psycho and the two walked away. She did her best to act unhurt, but when we got back to the store and went in the back room, she started crying. This was the first I heard that she was going to hurt Megan, but I didn't take it seriously because we all say things like that when we ourselves are hurt. The next time we ran into her was on purpose. Amy had come to the store to take my break with me, and on our way back from the food court, we took the long way past Hot Topic. I wasn't stupid enough to not know she was looking for Megan. I had always had my friend's back, and this night was no different. We walked into the store and Amy spotted her. She snuck up behind her and began calling her all sorts of terrible names again. Megan had been so surprised by Amy's appearance that she couldn't fight back. Instead, she ran into the back and hid. The other girls in the store told Amy to leave, and she gladly did with a feeling that she'd won that round. I'm not sure if she realized this would cause Megan to have a strike back at her, but she did, just 3 days later when she carved the word psycho into the side of her car with a key. Amy's parents had bought her that car for her 16th birthday, and she loved it almost as much as Neil. This had to be the night she decided to do it. She was so angry that her crying had morphed into blind rage. The only thing she said was, "I'm going to teach her a lesson." Nothing worse. So now perhaps you can understand why I was surprised by what she did. A week after the keying, we sat in Amy's newly painted car waiting for Megan to come out to her car after work. The plan was that we would overpower her, throw her in the trunk, and take her to the woods to teach her a lesson. That was all. Instead, when she did come out, Amy jumped out of her car and started running toward her. She'd moved so fast I couldn't catch up. She'd managed to sneak up behind her once again. Megan caught a glimpse of me running up, but it was too late. Amy grabbed her and spun her around, but instead of holding her, she began punching her and slapping her over and over. At this point, I don't even think Megan realized Amy had the knife. I didn't become aware until I was standing right next to them both and saw her white blouse covered with something dark, but I still wasn't sure what it was. It was all happening so fast. I yelled at Amy to remind her that the plan was to grab Megan and take her somewhere else, but she was in her own world. The glint on the blade caught my attention and I began screaming at her to stop, but the stabbing and slashing continued for at least another minute until she was too exhausted to go on. Megan had stopped fighting back long ago, but the ferocity of Amy's attack kept her upright until she stopped, and she slowly slid down the side of her car and landed with a dull thump. If she hadn't already passed, she certainly wasn't moving. Her eyes stared blankly ahead. When I finally summoned up the power to look over at Amy, she was completely covered in a dark mess and gasping with a wild look on her face. I was too scared to move now. She had me terrified of her. I was so enthralled I didn't notice the group of people coming out of the movies approaching us. When they were close enough to see what was going on, the two girls screamed and they all ran off back towards the theater. While I was watching all this going on, Amy still hadn't moved and remained still, oblivious to everything happening around her. I knew it was just a matter of time before the cops arrived, and I kept telling her that we had to go, but she didn't move. She remained in the same spot the whole time, staring into Megan's empty, dead eyes. I wanted to run, but I couldn't leave my best friend, and if she wasn't leaving, I was going down with her. So I did. It wasn't until later, when I had time to think about what had happened, did I realize she had lied to me to get my help, if she needed it. Maybe she thought I'd join in somehow. I don't know. But she had to have been crazy to think I would. I never claimed to be an angel or to be lacking some amount of blame. I freely admit that she didn't force me to be there that night, but had I known that she was planning what she was planning, there's no way I would have been there. Yes, I was willing to help her beat her up, but I see a big difference between that and something so cold-blooded as this. That's why I testified against her. She took the choice away from me, and in doing so, made me an accomplice. Regardless of what I did, my just being there while she did it makes me just as bad as her according to the law. A real friend would have given me the option to say no, but she didn't. That was the night our friendship ended forever. Now that I've served my 5 years and am free, it was important to me to get my side out, and I have. Whether anyone believes me or not, it doesn't matter. No one who wasn't there to witness what occurred has the right to judge me or my actions. I know what happened, and that's all that matters. I'm not sure how common Christmas holiday thefts and robberies are in your area, but in mine, they've become a real problem. Although the numbers have dropped somewhat since our state legalized the concealed carry of firearms, there's still enough idiots with a death wish to make it a concern. Last year, I had a very close call with 2 men that could have ended in very similar circumstances. We were around 2 weeks out, and every place in town that sold anything was packed. I've been fighting the crowds all day, and I was starting to feel beat down. My last stop was the little Kmart at the end of the strip mall. It was nearly 10 p.m. when I got there. Even that late in the evening, the parking lot was filled. I did finally find a spot, and it was all the way on the far side. The walk to the doors took forever, and I could barely keep my eyes open. For the next 30 minutes, I grabbed anything I could think of we needed at home. Finally, I headed to Sporting Goods and picked up the bike I had purchased earlier for my daughter. It soon became clear that walking with a basket and a bike wasn't going to work. I left the bike with a checker and took the grueling walk to my truck. As I left the store, I noticed 2 guys loafing around the doors. When I made eye contact with one of them and he looked away, I had a bad feeling. There had already been multiple robberies in that same parking lot, so my mind went straight to that possibility. They did their best to look casual, but I caught them watching me more than once. I began my walk to the truck, watching them the whole time, or trying to. A quarter of the way there, one guy turned back and headed for the doors. The other continued to follow me. When I made it, I noticed the guys circling towards me. I moved as fast as possible, throwing bags in the bed, and jumped into the cab. I pulled away just in time to avoid him. It was obvious I was being stalked now. In the hour I was in the store, the parking lot had cleared out, and I and only a handful of cars were left. My safest place was going to be at the front doors, so that's where I parked. On my approach, I noticed the other guys standing near them, but I still had to park there because I had to go in and get the bike. My hope was that the cameras and chance of being seen by a shopper would dissuade them. I parked the truck and got out as fast as I could and ran inside. Odds were that the longer I took in the store, the better the chance they would have time to form a plan. I moved as quickly as possible. I grabbed the bike and jogged it back outside. My efforts were all in vain. Just as I made it through the second set of doors, I could see both men pacing around, just a few feet away from my truck. I did the only thing I could think of. I rolled the bike between them as I ran, and they jumped out of the way just as I had hoped. This would give me the small amount of time I needed to throw the bike into the bed and get to safety of the cab and lock the door. I unfortunately misjudged how long it would take them to regroup. Before I could get the door completely open, I heard rocks crunching under someone's foot behind me, and I was forced to act in a way I'd hope I wouldn't have to. I pulled my pistol from under my shirt and pointed at the person behind me. I'd been avoiding taking things this far. Even pointing a gun at someone, not to mention shooting a person, is a very serious thing to do. When I spun around and aimed at the threat, I got my first close-up look at the guy who had been following me through the parking lot. Moving so fast caused me to lose my balance and fall back into the door. This is when he got a full view of the gun and stopped moving towards me. His eyes got real big and he threw up his hands in surrender. Just under his breath, I heard him say, "Okay, not worth getting shot," while backing away from me slowly. The other guy had been about to run after his friend until he saw him with his hands up. I could only assume he knew what was going on because he turned and ran off. Soon his partner followed. I'm glad he was focused on the gun, not my shaking hand holding it, or maybe he did, and this made him even more scared. I sat in the truck for a minute and caught my breath before I headed home. The tired feeling I'd had just an hour before was gone. It took at least 3 hours to relax enough so I could sleep. On the drive home, I mulled it over in my mind if I should call the police, but I eventually chose not to. No one had been hurt, and I got away with my presence. That duo must have gotten frightened off for the remainder of the holiday. I didn't hear any more robberies or car break-ins. Looking back on the incident is still a very sobering experience. When I think of how close I came to have to shoot somebody, I pause and thank God it didn't get that far. You may disagree with my actions and say no one's life is worth a couple of Christmas presents, but I say to you that the happiness of my children is worth far more. The thought of having to tell my daughter that I let 2 men take her bike without doing anything to stop them breaks my heart, and unless you're a psychopath, it would do the same to you. I grew up in a small city in Oklahoma with nothing much to do for kids my age. I wasn't young enough to be playing G.I. Joes in the yard, but I also wasn't old enough to drive to Tulsa to see a concert or something similar. What adults don't consider in places like that is when kids are left alone to find a way to entertain themselves, the thing they discover often gets them in trouble or sometimes even hurt. It was sometime in 1990. Myself, my brother, and his friend were bored out of our minds. We were on summer break from school and had been looking for something fun to do. This was before the time of online multiplayer gaming, and my friends and I couldn't spend all day inside playing them. Honestly, if they would have been around, we likely would have done it. Although I'm constantly on my son's back to get outside and experience the real world, I would have loved to have had those games when I was his age. Sick of flattening pennies on the railroad tracks, we were desperate to think of something to do. We threw out ideas one at a time until my brother suggested the idea of exploring in the old mall. I've known a few kids around town who have been inside of it, but I've always been kind of scared to check it out. When my brother suggested this, I agreed. Not because I wanted to, but rather because I didn't want to look like a wuss in front of the other kids. They were all younger than me, and they'd never let me live it down. I swallowed the lump in my throat and led the way through downtown and toward the older business district where most of the newer stores had been open in the 70s and 80s. With the new highway coming in, the majority of those stores moved closer to it and the old area died a slow death. One of those dead businesses was the new mall that had opened on the same spot as the original in 1976. By the time I have any memories of the place, its days were already numbered. Rumors of a new, bigger, and more modern mall with a multi-screen movie theater began spreading, and in 1985, when the ground was broken on it, just off of the brand new highway, the town couldn't wait. The opening of the new mall, a year and a half later, was the final nail in its coffin. By the Christmas holidays of 1987, all the stores had moved to the new mall, and the doors were locked soon after. We did our best to make sure no one saw us walking toward the old building by taking the long way around to the back to enter. Once we had pried the boards back from the door frame, we were inside. Even though it was a little dark and messy, it looked almost just like I had remembered it. I told everyone to stick close together so we wouldn't get lost, and despite the overcoming urge they all had to run off and explore on their own, I think the immense size of the place scared them more than they would ever let on. When my brother spotted one of the fountains, I happened to mention that people would make a wish and throw pennies in them. Upon hearing the money part, he and his friend ran off towards it to see if the pennies were still there. Of course, they weren't. I couldn't stop laughing for a long time, at least until I thought I noticed some movement off in the distance. I began to get very afraid, but then a group of pigeons flushed soon after and I could breathe again. Naturally, my brother and his friends wanted to go in that direction, so we did. Exploring turned out to not be as cool as I'd hoped. Most of the storefronts were covered with heavy steel gates that were impenetrable to a group of kids. We continued heading north toward the old J.C. Penney's until we noticed the gate on the arcade was open. As you can imagine, no games were left behind. It was nothing more than a big empty space with a restroom and back room for an office. Since others had been left there before us, the place was already trashed, but somehow my brother found an unbroken sink on the restroom floor and smashed it against another broken one. The office was filled with old clothes and sleeping bags. This was the first time I thought of people living in the building, and I got a chill down my back. I prayed to myself that no one was there while we were. Stories of kids disappearing in old houses started going through my head, and I suggested we go somewhere else. We left the empty arcade and continued toward Penny's. A few minutes later, we reached the old Gap store and we found a hole big enough for us to squeeze through the gate. It was basically like the arcade inside. Old clothes and trash were spread everywhere. We decided to leave and look elsewhere. I had a little harder time squeezing my fat butt through on the way out. After a bit of a struggle, I made it. When I stood up, I saw a man standing in front of the old J.C. Penney's. A jolt of fear went through me and I was frozen stiff. He just stood there, watching me intently. I could hear my brother and his friend behind me bickering about something, but I was too scared to say anything. The man kept watching until he noticed my brother squeeze out from behind me, followed by his friend. That's when he started yelling at us and running in our direction. My brother's friend was only halfway out of the hole when the guy started running. My first instinct was to run, and I did, but quickly remembered the other two with me. My brother was still back at the gate trying to yank his buddy out of the hole. His foot was hung up on something. The entire time this is going on, the man was getting closer. I was too scared to wait any longer and ran back to the gate and grabbed and ripped him from the hole. We got away just in time, it seemed. I was now running as fast as I could. My brother and his friend were fortunately right behind me. Unfortunately, the man was hot on their heels. I knew if I slowed down even just a little, he would catch us, and God knows what he would have done to us if he had. In less than a minute, we were back at the front doors and crawling out as quickly as we could. I watched anxiously as my brother and his buddy came out one by one after me. Before I could take a breath, I heard a man's voice say, "Well now, what are you boys up to?" I looked up to see a pair of police officers standing at the curb next to their car. I wasn't sure whether to be happy or not. I kept my mouth shut as one of them waved us over to him. This entire time, I'm expecting that man to come crawling out from behind the plywood on the door, but he never did. As we walked over to the officer, I told the other two under my breath to not say anything and let me talk. The officers met us halfway and continued to ask us about what we were doing. I only said that we were bored, so we went to look around, but we didn't see anything and were going back home. Just as I had finished my sentence, my brother's friend started to say something about the man chasing us, but I nudged him in the ribs and whispered for him to shut up. There was no way I was going to tell them I ran away from an adult who could have been a police officer like him. Where I grew up, we were far less afraid of the police than we were of our parents. I can guarantee you if they found out my brother and I ran away from a policeman, we would have both gotten a major whipping. I wasn't especially concerned about my brother getting spanked, but I would do anything to avoid hiding from my dad. And don't get worried, our father never abused us. We came from a very loving home, but whenever we made a big mistake, we knew a few whacks from his giant hands were soon to follow. Anyhow, what followed was the usual serious talking to about dangerous old places and responsibility. Then the officers drove us home. To my relief, my folks were both at work at the time, so they never heard about our trespassing incident. I was scared the police would call them or come by for about a week, but they never did. Although my brother and I did talk about it that night before bed, we never really figured out if that man in the mall was a policeman or not. The officers never said a word about him to us, so I didn't think he was. Once I arrived at that conclusion, the fear I first felt when I saw him began to creep back. I said nothing to my brother about this. It would have just scared him even more, and he may have told our parents, and I definitely didn't want that. None of us ever went back to the old mall. I didn't, and I never heard anyone else mention it. I also never saw that man that chased us ever again. We went on to other legally questionable things to occupy us, and before I realized it, school started again. Over the years, I'd heard crazy stories about the abandoned old mall. One or two people said there were satanic rituals going on in there. Another rumor talked about it being haunted. I ignored most of them, but a news report about a girl being abducted and taken in there to be assaulted did catch my attention. She stated that the man carried her into the abandoned pennies and had her way. I wondered for a little while if it was the same man, but I never saw a picture or anything else, so I let it go. In 2005, when the city finally made the decision to bulldoze the old place, I supported it fully. A plan to restore the building and make it some kind of expedition hall was thrown around briefly, but it ultimately went nowhere. I went down there the day of the demolition and took a few pictures. Seeing that old, rotten building go down filled me with a bit of belated relief. It seemed to serve as some type of way to close the book on a terrifying chapter from my past, regardless of how minor it may have been in hindsight. Not to mention the very idea of my son going into that dump all those years later scared me far more than any yelling and crazed man ever could have. Right after I turned 16, my sister's boyfriend got me a job at the mall's 5-screen movie theater. He was an assistant manager at the time and soon to become the head man in the following year. I enjoyed the job and stayed on until I went off to college a few years later. And even though I have a ton of scary stories that went down over my time there, and I may share those in the future, the one I'm sharing with you today occurred in the mall our theater was attached to. If I remember correctly, it was a Friday night just after school let out for summer break. The mall was packed like normal for a weekend night, and I was running around like crazy trying to make sure the snack bars stayed stocked, in addition to doing my job tearing tickets and keeping kids from sneaking into movies they didn't belong in. Soon, all the movies for the 7 o'clock show had started and things calmed down. I was in major need of a smoke, so I walked into the food court and lit up. The usual chaos was going on around me while I scoped out some girls standing at the Arby's counter. Suddenly, across the food court, a woman's scream blasted out over all the other noise and got my attention. It took me quite a while to understand what she was saying until I finally heard her say, "My daughter. Somebody help me, I can't find my daughter." Once I'd put it together, her actions made a lot more sense. She was running around frantically, looking closely at almost every young girl she passed. Several women heard her screams and were doing their best to calm her down and help. By now, a few of the other employees at the theater had heard the ruckus and came out to see what the matter was. I explained the little I'd heard to them, and we continued watching with a mixture of concern and ghoulish curiosity. The mother's panic and fear began to spread through the food court. Other mothers started calling and reaching out for their children. A security guard arrived, and the mother and a group of other shoppers were talking to him. He was soon joined by 2 other mall guards, and I could see them shaking their heads in a no motion. Hearing this caused the mother to begin crying, and a few women in the group attempted to soothe her. In a matter of seconds, the situation was to become a horror all mothers fear. While myself and a few girls from the snack bar were composing some possible theories among ourselves, a man came running into the mall from outside and approached one of the security guards. They said a few words to each other and walked back outside. We weren't sure what this meant, so we continued to sit and wait for any news. Less than 5 minutes later, we noticed the head security guard talking into his walkie-talkie. We knew the serious look on his face couldn't be good. He led the mother through the food court and out the doors. The mood in the food court was serious and almost no one was speaking. Some of the shoppers had a hopeful look on their faces, while most looked very scared. Although we hoped to see the mother come back with some good news, she never returned. Some shoppers were looking through the doors to the outside, and a few had walked out to get a better look, but could only see a group of people about 100 yards away, surrounded by flashing police lights and cars. When this news spread, the mood grew far grimmer. Things got so quiet at times you could hear a pin drop. We must have been gone too long because one of the assistant managers had to come out to bring us back to work. Even after we filled her in on what was happening, despite the concerned look on her face, she demanded we return to the theater. So, with a sense of growing dread, we returned to our jobs. I went back to my assigned tasks and tried to put the tense situation into the back of my mind. Probably 10 minutes before the last 7 p.m. show let out, an employee from the burger place came into the theater to fill us in on the missing child. He seemed to be overcome by the news as he told it to us. The good news was that they had found the little girl. The bad news was far worse. It appeared that the little girl, barely 5 years old, had gotten away from her mother somehow and ended up walking around alone in the parking lot. The last part was the hardest for him to say. At some point after she made it outside, a car that was cutting through the parking lot ran her over. By the time he'd gotten this part out, he was visibly weeping. The girl from the snack bar had been standing nearby listening, and they began bawling themselves. I could feel tears begin to well up in my eyes, so I slipped off to the broom closet to be by myself. The shoppers that had waited together in the food courts must have already heard the news for themselves. When I returned to the main floor, I could see small groups and sometimes single people leaving the mall with tears in their eyes. I almost began crying again, but I choked it back. Although the mall was open until 10 p.m., it was emptied out after the news had spread to most of the shoppers. I could see the employees inside the various businesses shutting down the gates and heading to their cars. All had the same distraught look on their faces that I and the rest of my coworkers probably had. The 9 p.m. rush came and went without me noticing. Once I finished my closing tasks, I caught a ride home from the guy in the ticket booth. On the ride home, not much was said. The next morning, I went about my day like I normally did. Washed my work clothes, had lunch, things such as that. The entire time I did my best to put the night before out of my mind. I think my sister tried to talk to me about it at some point, but I said nothing. That evening at the theater, most of us ambled through our jobs like a group of zombies. Occasionally a customer would bring it up, but none of us felt like talking about it. At the end of the night, I called my dad to pick me up. I hoped he hadn't heard about it because I knew he'd want to talk about it if he had. That was the last thing I wanted to talk about. The whole scene was just too depressing for me. I was happy he hadn't. After reading the Sunday comics in the paper, a rush of morbid fascination led me to search for an article regarding the incident. I was hoping the guy who had told me was wrong, but when I came across an article laying out the entire ghoulish scene, I knew he wasn't. According to the paper, the driver was a 43-year-old man from Allen. He swore he hadn't seen the little girl. The police confirmed that even with his headlights on, that area of the parking lot was hard to see in. When asked if the mother would see any charges, the police answered with a firm no. The article ended with a brief quote from the mother. She simply said, "I can't believe this has happened. My husband says I shouldn't blame myself, but I do and always will. Without my daughter here, I don't want to live." All these years later, I still tear up when I remember that terrible night. 5 years ago, I was reminded of it when my youngest managed to slip away from me. Even though he was quickly found, I could see nothing but that poor mother's face before me and think that she was never able to experience the relief I was feeling at that moment, and never would. I've heard a lot of stories here in which individuals have discussed some of the most scary and horrible things that have happened to them in their lives. A lot of them have sounded like they were very traumatic at the time in which they occurred, but a small amount wasn't even half as bad as the person thought it was. I'm sorry, but if you have to get therapy for the rest of your life because your boyfriend slapped you, you have much bigger problems than your choice of men. I don't want to be mean, but many people make things into being far bigger than they really are. Half of the things I've heard recently have been the textbook definition of first world problems. If you want to hear a recounting of a real horrible event in which I was involved, pay close attention. At 16, I was emancipated from my parents because of repeated abuse suffered by me and my sister. While my sister, who was only 12 at the time, was sent to live with our aunt, I moved into an apartment with my boyfriend. Despite it being terribly hard to find a job at that age to pay my bills, I did it, and I don't mean by selling myself like many of the runaways and the street girls I had met. Even though it meant we didn't get to see much of each other, my boyfriend's job at his family's company allowed us to live a stable and happy life. A life far better than I'd ever known growing up. My 17th birthday was the first year I'd ever received an actual present that wasn't purchased at a dollar store or shoplifted from Goodwill. My only regret at the time was that I couldn't bring my sister along with me, but the judge felt I was too young to handle such a large responsibility. I've been raising her for as long as I could remember, but he didn't want to hear it. August 14th of 2005 was my sister's 13th birthday, and I wanted to buy her something really special. A few days before her party, Brendan, my boyfriend, and I had a rare day off together, and he volunteered to drive me to the mall to get her a gift. Since he was the one doing the driving, we had to take his beloved BMW M3 that his dad had bought him for his 16th birthday. There were many times I truly believed that he loved that car more than me, but the pettiness of thinking that made me ashamed. He dreamed his whole life of owning one of those cars and had been working any job he could get since he was 12 to save money for one. He'd no doubt earned it, but this fact was sometimes lost on me. Any of you ladies out there who has a man that seems to love his car more than life itself will hopefully understand the petty jealousy I often felt towards his. It wasn't out of the ordinary to have guys approach him and tell him how cool the car was. I think he liked the attention the car got, and it got him. The second we parked, I could tell the two men were lusting over the M3. It became very obvious quickly that I wasn't what they were eyeballing. I continued to watch their focus, and it never broke from that car for a second. Unfortunately, the two stores I checked didn't have what I needed. Brendan and I stopped to have a slice and then headed back to the car. As soon as we exited the mall, we saw the two guys I'd noticed earlier, standing around the car like they were waiting for us to return. The time was approaching 9 p.m. and it was already getting dark. The parking lot was almost completely empty. As we got closer to the guys, I started to get a weird vibe from the two. Their body language was tense and unnatural, and as they spoke to each other, they would laugh in an obviously uncomfortable manner, almost like they were attempting to soothe their nerves. I assume this was because they were a little younger than Brendan and nervous about talking to him. When I got to the car, I went around to the passenger door to get in like normally. Brendan said hi to them and asked if he could help, in a friendly manner. The taller of the two asked him if the car was for sale. None of the guys came off as aggressive in any way at this point, and Brendan was never anything other than respectful to them. He didn't have to think about the offer. His answer was a brief, matter-of-fact no. Thinking it ended right there, he began to turn his back and get in the car, but apparently that wasn't good enough for the guy, and he must have felt Brendan should rethink the offer. He grabbed Brendan as he turned. "Hey, don't turn your back on me. I wasn't finished talking to you. The rich boy thinks he's too good to talk to us." When he said the last part, he was facing his friend. Being no stranger to people with aggressive attitudes, a sick feeling grew in my stomach. Brendan did his best to defuse the situation, but it quickly became clear that the dude wanted a confrontation. Once more, this time around in a far more aggressive manner, he asked Brendan if he wanted to sell the car, and once again, he did his best to decline the offer in a friendly way. Then the guy changed tactics and demanded that Brendan give him the car. When he said this, I started to feel very scared. This idea must have struck him as insane because when Brendan heard it, he began laughing uncontrollably in the guy's face. His expression showed just how angry Brendan's reaction made him. This was when he pulled the gun and stuck it in Brendan's face. My body began shaking the second I saw it. Now it seemed we were getting to the actual goal of this exchange. We were going to be robbed. I glanced over at the other a-hole standing at the back of the car. His rotten teeth-filled smile made the bile rise up from my stomach and into my mouth. Just the taste almost caused me to vomit, but I managed to stifle it back. His buddy with the gun told Brendan, through gritted teeth, to laugh in his face again. Wisely he didn't. He attempted to de-escalate again by trying to reason with the guy. He told him that the car wasn't actually as great as it looked. The fact was that it cost a lot of money to maintain, but the guy said nothing. I saw Brendan's expression change at this point. It was a look I'd only ever seen once. He was terrified and knew he was in trouble. This desperation caused him to do something very foolish. When the guy looked back toward his partner, Brendan grabbed for the gun. They began fighting for control of it, and soon fell on the ground out of my sight. I was afraid the guy's partner would rush to help him, so I rushed him instead. It didn't take long for him to throw me off. Just as I landed, I heard the shot. It made me jump. I had to see if anyone had been hurt. When the guy with the gun ran past me to his car, followed by the other, a horrible feeling came over me. Even before I'd seen him, I knew Brendan had been shot. Honestly, I was too terrified to look, but I knew I had to. What I saw would take away my will to live for many years to come. He was lying flat on his back, writhing silently in pain and staring hopelessly into the starless sky. I shuffled over to him as fast as possible in a vain attempt to stop the blood pouring from his stomach. Doing my best to make his end as peaceful as possible, I held him and sang quietly to him as he slowly bled out of my arms. I'm not really sure how long we stayed there. Does it really matter? I'm sure he'd already been dead for some time when the ambulance and police showed up. Those monsters ended his life for this stupid car. In the end, didn't even bother to take it with them when they left. What a waste. If anybody reading this cares about what happened to the two guys, I have 2 words for you. Not much. The shooter was able to cut a deal on a lesser charge and is scheduled to be released sometime next year. As for his little buddy, his age at the time and it being his first conviction was taken into consideration. The yuckmouth sleazoid only served 5 years with an additional 10 of probation. If you've done the math, you realize he'll be free and clear himself soon. No 2 men in the history of crime got off so easily. If I would have been born a man, I would have committed a crime just in the hopes I'd be put in the same place as one or both of them, so I could break a shank off into their guts and watch them bleed, just as I had to watch the only man in my life who has ever treated me with respect or love. It's painfully clear that I still have a long way to go before I'm able to put this behind me, if I ever can. If you've made it this far, then maybe you can now understand even a little why I've criticized some of the other submitters of these stories. However, maybe due to my stubborn determination to deal with Brendan's death myself, I've ruined my chance to move beyond it. Perhaps then, getting to the place in my life where I'm able to share this story with another person was assisted by those very same people I criticize. I'm still not sure. The last 14 years have been a long series of ups and downs, and I'm still very confused about much of it. Regardless of my petty sniping, I thank everyone who's had the bravery to publish their terrible times. I'm only here because of you. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe and click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And join my Discord to interact with me and other listeners directly. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data, located on both Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon. Strawberry Ice Cream says, I want to smack a thick cat. Oh, poor thick boy. Why are you smacking him? Like on his booty?